This project was not inspired by the Barbie movie, but by the pink gingham Prada set worn by Margot Robbie at a promotional event for the Barbie movie, which, now that I think about it... But in all seriousness, a lot has happened since starting and stopping this project last summer, and I wasn't sure how else to start this year, other than by tying up loose ends, from all the crochet colour work, that is. For this project, I used 3 different colours to achieve the illusion of a gingham weave. 2 would also suffice, but would require infinitely more yarn changes, and I'll say it like it is, not in this economy. The technique I'll be using is basically just a two-faced lying patchwork, because it's not even patchwork, it's tapestry crochet. If you've seen any of my other crochet videos, you might know exactly why I use this stitch, but one of my New Year's resolutions is to stop telling everyone that my favourite crochet stitch is the half double crochet waistcoat stitch, and it wasn't very easy because it feels like a complicated stitch while having to carry as well, and as you can see the carries are really easy to see, which isn't a huge problem, but I feel like a single crochet would work better, and I don't really want to go down to the normal waistcoat stitch because I just feel like that would just be even harder. Phew, that was a close one. Anyway, I then tried single crocheting, which seemed like a good option for a relatively scaled down gingham pattern, and after some greasy elbow action, it was perfect. A perfectly poor excuse for a swatch, but a swatch nonetheless. The squares didn't measure perfectly, but neither did the imperial system, and yet here we are, billions of cups, tablespoons, and thimblefuls later, in absolute shambles. Of course that could mean thousands of millions, or even millions of millions, which would also be trillions, but none of these amounts even came close to the mountain of stitches I was about to willpower my way through. After all, one of the first lessons we learn is that single crocheting an entire garment, however big or small, is not for the faint of heart. All I had to do next was to start on the front panel. In hindsight, I don't know that I would make separate panels again, but it was the easiest way for me to freehand this project with this much colour work. I think the squares are a little too wide, so I'm just going to add another row on top. And to be honest, it's because I didn't continue swatching. I think if I swatched a little more, I would have noticed this earlier. You may have spotted the questionably loose foundation chain, and to be honest with you, I probably did too. But this was back when I exercised considerably more denial masked as optimism in my day-to-day life. In fact, if I remember correctly, I think it was actually on purpose, because I recall being worried that it would end up too tight and ruin the flare of the skirt. So I definitely overcompensated for it. That said, it still worked. I'll be the first to admit it. The promotion for this movie had me in its perfectly pink manicured grasp. I even recreated the first ever Barbie outfit last year on my channel, all the while still in total denial about just how much I wanted to watch the film. And to prove to you the sheer extent to which this was the case, I even hobbled over to the BuzzFeed website to take the quiz, of course, and lo and behold, to the surprise of absolutely no one, I was Weird Barbie, and somewhere in the dark, gooey recesses of my mind, I felt a little special. But then the day came to finally watch it, and anticipation swiftly turned into apprehension. Many of us left Barbie behind for one reason or another, and who was to say whether or not this trip to the movie theatre wasn't going to be just another reminder of it. Half a year later, I'm glad I experienced it. The numbers have spoken, and mine remains but a drop in the box office ocean. Let's talk about the costume. At first, my jaded subconscious had this crazy idea that the costumes in a movie about Barbie would be based on silhouettes that would give Thierry Mugler in the 90s a run for his money, since to my childhood self, that was Barbie, otherworldly, with hyper-feminine proportions that us primordial blobs could only aspire to morph into, if the physics of biology ever allowed it. On the other hand, my conscious grown self was relieved that this was totally not the case. Jacqueline Duran, the costume designer for the film, explained that she wanted the costume to feel timeless, and I feel like this approach may have helped to shift focus away from Barbie's controversial figure over the decades and towards the garments themselves instead. One of the things I really liked about the costume was that it felt like the clothing was made for the actors and not the other way around, all the while still looking like dolls' clothing, and I thought that was super fun and likely a really difficult balance to get right. Too often, women's fashion has dictated the ideal body, its shape and proportions. To wear a certain fashion well, women are expected to either come naturally equipped with the very same frame, or to somehow make it happen, only for ideals to change in a matter of seasons, or a decade if we're lucky. So Jacqueline Durran's timeless approach was for me a really well executed aspect of the movie, because it felt different. Growing up with Barbie taught us that everything looked good on her, not because her wardrobe was amazing, but because she was still Barbie underneath it all. Buckets of time had passed and I had successfully, or so I thought, incorporated decreases in a way that resembled dots in the gingham pattern. Admittedly, I was quite proud of this, but the trouble with freehanding was knowing when to stop for the waist. As pretty as pink gingham is, the frogging is significantly uglier should you work past the points of no return, especially with all the yarn ends. And this was the front panel. It didn't line up perfectly on the stand since I was going off of my own measurements, but nothing seemed to have gone wrong, yet. I'm taking out another row here for reasons I think were actually more to do with the fit than the length. The main difference between these two panels was that I decided on a centre back zipper, which I totally regret, but it could have been worse, even though I can't really think of how. So this is the back progress so far. I've split it into two parts so that I can insert the zipper in the middle. I did think about putting the zipper on the side, but I wasn't sure if it was going to affect the overall silhouette since it could be a bit bulky. But at least if it's at the back, it will still be visible unfortunately, but it probably wouldn't affect the silhouette as much. Lengthwise, I think I'm going to add 2 more rows of squares to the top. I think if I was doing this all over again, I probably would change the placement to the side since that would be a lot less disruptive, but I don't know. I was having a pretty bad time with side zippers, so this was the result. It did make me wonder, for the nth time, how many major life decisions are governed by limited experiences that represent anything but reality, but nothing can go back in time and fix the even looser foundation chain I made for the second panel, so it's not like lessons were going to be learned either way. And you really won't believe what happened next. I was dumbfounded, as in I found something really dumb. Not only did I somehow decide that it was fine not to finish one square row, that I could just make up for it in the next section with a rectangular row instead, in the same colour combination. At this point, I can only imagine the repetition was making things blurry and my brain just tapped out, went on vacation and said it would be back in a week's time. Either that or it was sabotage for taking on the project in the first place. It's hard to tell. Okay, so it turns out that I actually made a mistake much earlier on, so I'm going to have to frog back to the first mistake and start all over again. So I think the pink gingham elephant in the room is that the Barbie monolith we saw in the cinema probably didn't resemble the Barbie monolith we grew up with. This was certainly the case for me. On a personal level, my interest in Barbie dolls was significant, but short-lived. For me, Barbie simply wasn't the role model Ruth Handler intended the doll to be, and there were only so many irreversible haircuts and Velcro pulls I could handle before boredom set in. But this project had me flipping through entire brain cells, trying to recall what Barbie used to be like. And I felt it was conveyed really well in the scene when Sasha and her friends teamed up as the Bratz dolls and unleashed every awful thing Barbie ever represented onto stereotypical Barbie. This moment admittedly felt quite cathartic when aimed at the problematic plastic doll from my youth, but super mean when directed at Margot Robbie. Touché, Greta, touché. The real-world Bratz versus stereotypical Barbie dynamic also reminded me of a TikTok I saw about the shift in recent fashion history, referred to as both the whiteout and the Prada effect in Vogue's Supreme Model series at the beginning of episode 5, because there felt like there was a potential link between this time in fashion history and the historic battle of the fashion dolls, with a Z. Plus, this is technically a Prada-inspired project, which by itself totally makes the link from a purely logical standpoint. First off, it's helpful to explain what the whiteout or Prada effect was. These terms were used to describe the homogenization of models in the fashion industry, shifting from the comparatively diverse supermodels of the 80s and 90s to lesser-known models of primarily white European descent, many scouted from Eastern Europe in particular. Along with being the same race, the models were also recruited for being of similar, if not the same height, shape, and size. The lack of diversity could even be compared to the Barbie section at any given toy shop during the same period. Of course, models of color and non-stereotypical Barbies still existed, but they were relatively few and far between. I'm assuming this was all somewhat dependent on geography, but this is what I personally remembered, and also seems to be the case according to my research, so let me know if you had a different experience. Now, Prada wasn't the only fashion house to implement this change, but has been said to have been the one to have led it. It was suggested that the reason behind this industry-wide shift was that the designers wanted the attention to be on their work and not the individual models, which as a thing in and of itself made sense following the era of the supermodel, when top models were often paid more attention to than the actual designers they were wearing. But that still doesn't explain how exclusion would be the answer. So it turns out that this shift in fashion overlapping with Barbie's own relative homogeneity may not have been a coincidence. To paraphrase Jacqueline Duran in an interview about designing the Barbie movie costumes, Barbie's clothing and contemporary fashion has always been interlinked. And back to my own commentary, it's easy to see how this applied to more than just the clothing. The only difference being that Barbie was a selling point for the clothing, and the models were apparently meant to be little more than walking mannequins. And yet it's hard to see how the models didn't play an integral part in product appeal, even if it wasn't in the same way or to the same extent as Barbie, lest we forget that they were actual people and not dolls, despite the irony of the term Russian doll being used by some to describe this very same era. You couldn't even make this up without it sounding like badly written fiction. I kind of feel like it would have been more interesting if the actual Russian nesting dolls were somehow relevant. Knitting 30 sweaters with each sweater smaller than the last, you say? Now that would be a fashion show. But I digress. Mattel eventually stepped up its diversity game in the mid-2010s, and unsurprisingly, this timing came soon after the reported end of the whiteout. Which begs the question, why couldn't, or rather didn't Barbie do what the Bratz did first? You may already be familiar with the idea of reps till failure, but I like to exercise by the notion of reps till boredom, so I left some tidying for later. Now, back to what I thought was the mostly finished back panel, but to my abject horror, I soon discovered that I had committed a crime of right and wrong, but mostly wrong.
I've just realized that I started the second panel at the wrong place.
Basically, I had totally ignored the alternating pattern of the flat worked single crochet and completely annihilated the stitch continuity of the top half. Practically speaking, it probably wasn't that bad, seeing that it went unnoticed for so long, but on paper, it was screaming at me.
I should have started it from the center, but I started from the edge, which means that now my stitches don't actually match on both sides. Working from the edge just felt easier at the time, but I don't think it was worth it in the end. So I don't think you can even tell the difference really on camera. There is a slight indentation on this second side that you don't really have on this side. Again, it's not a big deal. I think I'm just having a moment. I'm so tempted to redo this. I know it's going to take a long time, I know I'm going to hate all of it, but the thought of completing everything knowing I already have a problem with it, I don't think I can do it.
The more I knit and crochet, the more it seems to have just been a rule that I just never fully acknowledged prior to the V-neck vest I made after this project. There is a right place to start, usually from the left, even if it feels more awkward than it's worth. So of course I frogged the entire left section and was really hoping that my tension stayed exactly the same so the yarn didn't end up short by a few stitches.
Although that was kind of painful, I do feel a little better now. It's time to block everything.
Before I could seam the skirt together, I needed to block the fabric, and I carelessly read somewhere that salt would help the dye to stay attached to the fibers. only to discover quite a while later that this apparently only applies to the initial dyeing process and not to prevent already dyed fabric from running. So this ended up being more trouble than it was worth because of the whole saline corroding the metal pins thing. Let's just not go there. I actually rinsed it out a couple of times, but eventually found that saltiness is more than just a state of mind. It's a condition. The pink salt wasn't a fun Barbie gimmick or anything, it was the only salt I had to hand at the time, and I also had no idea how much I was even supposed to use, if using correctly of course. So as far as I could tell back then, it worked perfectly, bar the rusty pins, because there was no transfer between the pinks and the white. And in case you're wondering how did this even happen, I left everything to block for quite a while. There were just some lessons in life that hit harder later instead of in the moment. For the bralette top, I decided to work in a similar way to the last bralette I made, except instead of using the same irregular pattern, I decided to make things symmetrical so that crocheting and fitting the band would be as straightforward as possible. Back to Barbie Land versus Bratz World. Some of us may remember how much the bright pink Barbie brand suddenly paled in comparison to that of the Bratz dolls after their first release onto the scene. Which reminds me, does anyone remember My Scene, aka Mattel's own answer to the Bratz doll dynamic? Honestly, thinking about the whole fashion doll turf war is shedding a new light on the name for me. It's almost as if Mattel was trying to say something. Although I'm not too familiar with the Bratz lore, and they likely had their own 2000s doll issues, it's clear that they were designed with diversity in mind. This has been cited as one of the major reasons for their success, and the dolls even outsold Barbie in the UK back in 2004. The hilarious part being that the Bratz were created by a former employee of Mattel, Carter Bryant, for MGA Entertainment. Unsurprisingly, Mattel wasn't pleased about the new competition, and litigations ensued throughout the years that followed. This all made me very curious as to which doll was actually the most popular, so I went over to Instagram to ask you which one you thought was best before and after 2015, the year Mattel decided to finally change their ways, after Barbie sales dropped for the third year running in 2014. Obviously, this poll was in no way scientific, given that Pokemon was one of the options, for good reason of course, but the results were interesting. The Bratz ended up being the most popular pre-2015, with Barbie and Pokemon almost at a draw, but fast forward to today, and Barbie took the lead by a whopping 20% above the Bratz, with Pokemon surpassing the dolls with a passion for fashion by 2%. It's worth noting that the Bratz were discontinued in 2016, so this may not have been the fairest of competitions, but the results still made sense given Barbie's comeback over the last decade. Although I wasn't expecting Barbie to win by quite this much, especially with Mattel having taken a leaf out of the Bratz doll playbook. When it comes to the dolls, the results seem to reflect the mainstream consensus both then and now, with the Bratz being slightly more popular than Barbie back then, but with Barbie being much more popular now. It was really great having your input, so thank you to everyone who voted, especially Team Pokemon, because together we can be the very best, like no one ever was. If you feel like you missed out, you know exactly where to find us. Now let us all bask in the warmth of our shared nostalgia. It's probably the best part. It's safe to say that Mattel has certainly made moves in the right direction, although for some, there might still be quite a way to go. The real-world Bratz vs Barbie scene mentioned earlier included both East Asian and Latina Bratz-adjacent characters, but the same couldn't be said for the actual Barbies in Barbie Land. Whether this was meant as commentary or not, it certainly helped to illustrate the disparity between Barbie and the Bratz historically speaking, and possibly still poses a question about Barbie today, especially given how much emphasis was put on making Barbieland so inclusive. To be clear, I definitely wasn't expecting the movie to fix every problem in the doll's long history and suddenly become the pinnacle of inclusion in 114 minutes. But it kind of looked like that was the goal. Cue Will Ferrell with a clipboard and cartoonishly small print checklist. Brush off Barbie's unrealistic proportions with Ruth Handler's body image while completely ignoring the doll's adult origins, heavily catered to the male gaze. Check. Use the actual suffering of indigenous people to explain why the dolls in Fantasyland just don't get the patriarchy, but don't worry about actual indigenous representation. Check. For a film that seemed to be made with the intention of representing everyone, or at least as many people as possible, there is a question of what it means for the audience and overall concept when it inevitably falls short in some way. Like literally everyone is a Barbie, except for you, and you're just Ken.
So now I just have to fill in all of the gaps.
Including everyone is too unrealistic, so you'll just have to hope that it was down to sheer luck of the draw, and not a carefully selected set of demographics or anything like that. But would a story about only stereotypical Barbies have performed just as well? Maybe, maybe not. This won't apply to everyone, but for some, if not many of us, the doll, just like the fashion industry, has promoted exclusivity for longer than it hasn't, seeming to embrace the opposite once others have proven it to be fruitful. So really, I'm just wondering what it would even take for me to no longer feel cynical about Barbie, if all of this still wasn't enough. I have only watched the movie the one time, and I do hope that if I were to watch it again, that maybe I'll see it in a better light than the first time, but only time will tell.
I also have this much yarn left, so let's see if it's going to work out. That was a close one. Bad news. As you can see, the pattern doesn't match because I'm missing a row, so I have several options, possibly only 3 actually. The first option is to ignore the pattern and just carry on as usual. The second option is to redo both of these, which I really don't want to do. And the third option is to basically undo all the work I've done on this side and add another row on top, and then carry on and fill in all the gaps, like I said before. I'm really tempted to just undo all of this. Actually, yeah, I have to redo all of this. The reason why this happened is because I drew out the patterns separately, and I didn't put them together, so I couldn't really see how they matched up. But before I get rid of all of this, I'm going to see how it looks on the stand. Okay, so the shaping is looking pretty good so far, and I think I figured it out. Instead of frogging all of this and then adding another row on top, I'm going to just frog an extra row. That way it will still match, and it will end up shorter, but I think that might end up being a good thing.
And since the bralette was kind of more bra than let, I decided to go with this option. I'm not sure if you can tell, but I love pink, and if I had to hazard a guess, I likely first became interested in Barbie because she was the source of it. Plus, children's TV advertising was one of the most powerful forces on Earth back then, so who really knows? The movie promotion from last year only reawakened this Pavlovian conditioning stemming all the way back to my formative years, and I really appreciated just how incredibly pink the movie itself was. But little did I know back then that growing up actually meant getting down to pink tacks, because brass tacks just seemed so dull and masculine. Pun aside, the pink tax is when products and services specifically marketed towards women are marked up in price, compared to similar ones targeted towards men. Examples include clothing, healthcare products, and even children's toys, with girls' toys priced 7% higher on average, according to a 2015 study by the New York City Department of Consumer Affairs. But one of the perks about being a girl boss is that you get to participate in mindless consumption, right? After all, that's what Barbie's been promoting for decades, and we all know glitter isn't free. I thought it was quite poetic that Barbie's real-world, quote, glorification of rampant consumerism was reflected throughout the movie in the form of product placement with the likes of Chevrolet, Tag Heuer, and how could we possibly forget Chanel, tightly in frame. Now, controversially perhaps, I actually think these placements provide an accurate depiction of the zeitgeist, in other words, the absolute state of affairs, so in these ways, it kind of works. Despite how much the creators overcame in making a feminist movie that performed so successfully at such a huge scale, which was no small feat by any means, it still didn't stop people, now including myself, from pointing out that the Barbie movie was still an amazing advertisement for Mattel. More was spent on marketing than the movie itself, and that the very screen time was an ad space opportunity that was inevitably taken advantage of. How much the latter impacts the former is unique to the individual, but let's not forget that the movie simply couldn't have been made without Mattel at the helm in some capacity. So it was either this film, which was almost a whole decade in the making, or potentially no film at all. Unless we're all okay to wait until Barbie is finally released into the public domain, after which an independent horror will inevitably be released about the doll with a passion for fascism. Or something along those lines. That is, if Winnie the Pooh and Steamboat Willie are anything to go by. At the end of the day, do I wish that profiteering off of feminism isn't what greenlights it? Sure, but hold on to that thought while I run this ad. Unfortunately, after all the intense seaming and construction, I ended up with some rather peculiar mounds that were reminiscent of I'm not quite sure what exactly. Perhaps those almond joys that I've heard so much about.
Why does it look like this?
As you can see, I messed up the tension of the separate pieces by stitching too much of the I-cord edging into the band, and to add insult to injury, the bubble wrap quality of these shapes made it hard to resist the intrusive thoughts. Which eventually won. Will somebody please think of the children? Next, I made a start on the straps, which were pretty straightforward, especially since I didn't need to include the gingham pattern on the undersides. It was a decent distraction from the correction I had to make, but this was all before figuring out how this top was going to come together, since as of this point, there was still no closure in either sense of the word.
Okay, it's not looking great, but I think I can fix it. So the major issue I have with this construction is that clearly this side is a bit messed up. So I undid this side, and it's looking a lot better just sitting as it is. You can see that this side has a really funny profile. I'm going to restitch both of these back in, but this time I'm going to leave the I-cord out instead of stitching it in. I'm also not very happy with this top line here, so I'm going to redo the whole thing. And don't mind this. I was just trying to tighten everything up to see if it would flatten everything, and it does, so it was my tension that was the issue. So yeah, I'm going to undo everything and try and make it look nice, and hope that it doesn't mean that I have to redo literally everything, because at this point, it's still a possibility. So now I'm just going to get rid of this seam here. That's looking better.
I settled on an elasticated bag, which to this day I'm still struggling to describe. To make the bag, I double knit horizontal sections before threading the elastic through each one. Again, in hindsight, I probably would have used a side zipper like the Prada top, but I didn't manage to find an open zipper in a suitable length or colour. In the distant past, I may have even felt a slight but passive resentment towards the Barbie trope, in the sense that there were times I felt unable to dress the way I wanted to because of society's seemingly constant shaming of pink girly things and the people who enjoyed them, thanks in part to Barbie's reputation over the decades. I feel like the Simpsons episode Lisa vs Malibu Stacy is a great example to look at. The episode did a fantastic job at satirizing Barbie at the time, after Mattel released the infamous Math is Tough Teen Talk Barbie doll, but it still pokes fun at the girls and Waylon Smithers for still choosing the very pink Malibu Stacy over the not pink but otherwise superior Lisa Lionheart doll, all because she had a new hat. And in the episode, this was totally warranted considering the mindless consumerism displayed for a doll that said things like, "I wish they taught shopping at school," and "Don't ask me, I'm just a girl." But as a child watching this episode,
Here we go.
it didn't so much as make me want to be a Lisa Lionheart girl, as it made me not want to be a Malibu Stacy girl. I mean, why couldn't Lisa Lionheart have worn pink as well? I think we all know the answer. She was simply not like the other girls.
Oops.
Did I really go there? I'm just kidding, of course, I think. I hope. It was the 90s. Don't get me wrong, it's still one of my favorite episodes, and looking back, it's still, if not more impressive to see just how much it managed to do and say in only half an hour, compared to the Barbie movie, which was almost 2 hours long, but apples and oranges, I suppose. Fortunately, there has been a significant shift in recent times with things like bimbification, the coquette aesthetic, and of course Barbiecore, which to its credit has helped to push things even further forward. The irony is that I owe some of my newfound ability to make and wear my dream closet, or at least a micro mini two-piece part of it, to the monumental global event that was Barbie the movie. Without it, I simply wouldn't have crocheted this super cute gingham set, but what a great excuse to. In truth, and somewhat conveniently, I see it as neither a Prada nor a Barbie set, since it technically isn't either. But as an outfit I would have looked at and absolutely adored as a child. Making this video wasn't the easiest, not least because I've forgotten how I made everything over the last several months, but because I felt there was something I still hadn't quite grasped. Deep down, despite how drawn I felt to make this project, there was still a sense of indifference about the Barbie topic, and I wondered how much of it was because I didn't want to be disappointed by what I found. But after some admittedly labored soul searching throughout this process, it all seems to come down to the same realization I had at single digits. I'm not a Barbie girl, and likely never was, but what has been clear for quite some time now is that this is a Barbie world, so we may as well start dressing like it. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one.